Welcome. This is Hernan Murdoch. Let's take a look at how we go about phrasing questions and in different types of questions we can ask. So, we spend a great deal of time talking about interviewing and verbal communications and how we go about phrasing them. So, to help us better understand some of the dynamics associated with this, we have with us today Kathleen Crawford. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hello, how are you?
I am well, thank you. So, we need a little bit of help looking at some of these dynamics around verbal communications and how we can go about making them more effective. So, if we're to think in terms of the different dynamics around it, what are some of the key things we need to consider as we start this conversation around verbal communications?
Well, I think what we have to start with is that part of the role of the interviewer or the meeting organizer is to support the person or the group that they are interacting with. We know what we want, but how do we explain what we want in terms of information as far as its depth, its complexity, and so forth? So I'd like to start with these 5 factors in phrasing questions. We have to think about the language. So language in terms of simple, clear requests for a limited amount of information. We don't want to ask compound questions. We don't want to have a soliloquy and then say, so what do you think of that? Simple, clear requests for a limited
Hmm.
amount of information. Relevance, it has to relate to this person. It has to be something that this person is in a position to know about. So something
Hmm.
by virtue of their role, their responsibility, their position, the scope of work that they do. So the phrasing of the question should be about not something hypothetical, but something about what they do and how they do it.
Okay. Okay. So asking the right person, the right questions. Okay. Good
Absolutely,
place to start.
absolutely.
Okay.
And then in terms of information level, another thing about how this relates to number one, number three relates to number one. We're not just going to ask a very, very open-ended question and expect a lecture from them. Again, we are an interruption to their work in doing our work. So let's make sure that it's a clear, direct request, as I said, but also let's make sure that the information level that we need is what we ask for. We'll speak more about that when we talk about degrees of open-endedness and closed-endedness in questions, which is coming
Mhm.
up in subsequent graphics. And then complexity. Is it, if it's a complex situation like a multifaceted process or system, then I would argue again for simplicity. Let's break it down into its component parts and let's make sure that we follow the thread of the logic by parsing out the questions that we ask instead of, again, a lot of compound information.
Okay.
The last one is information accessibility. This has really 2 aspects that I'd like to focus on. And one is that many of us have become so accustomed to how we do our work that when asked questions about it, it may be hard to really give a solid overview of it. So what you might want to do is to make sure you send an agenda ahead of time so that it makes it easier for someone to recall the specifics of some of the more arcane things that they do. But also they may need documents and data. And they need to have them at hand in able to respond to some of our questions. So we want to think about that too, and how can we make it easier on the person or group in front of us to recall what we would like them to recall, especially if it's not commonplace or events that happen all the time and that sort of thing.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, no, this is very helpful because it helps us organize our thoughts before we even start the process and thinking in terms of what we want to find out, what we want to get from this exchange, and make it as productive as possible for us as well as for the individual we're working with. So, you mentioned open ended and closed ended questions. Can you tell us a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more about those as we start to think about the specific questions we want to ask?
Yes, absolutely. So open-ended questions are going to result in more dialogue. They're specifically designed to get more detail and or longer answers. So think of 5W and 2H. These are who, what, when, where, why, how, and how much. Usually open-ended questions are going to start with one or more of those words. And we have to be careful, though, as we follow those words, not to be too vague nor too complex in phrasing our questions. Hence my point about compound questions on the previous graphic. Also, let's not be like the prosecutor in Perry Mason, the old Perry Mason show. I know I'm totally dating myself when I say that, but we have people who watch TV Land out there. So let's not ask a leading question. We don't want to suggest what we want the answer to be. We really want what the answer is. So let's be careful with our phrasing around open-ended questions as well as closed-ended ones. And the last thing here is degrees of open-endedness. A highly open-ended question is one where you might say something like, tell me more about this. And that's one danger point that I made on the previous graphic, is that an invitation to tell somebody everything about what they do, especially if they love what they do, could be very entertaining, but it might not turn out to be very practical. So let's think about how to moderate those open-ended questions. And what we do in terms of moderating the or making the open-ended question less wide open is bring it down to a specific aspect that you're interested in. So maybe you have no trouble following the process up until this particular handoff or some sort of thing like that. So you can say something like, I think I followed you all the way to this, but could you tell me more about that? Highly open-ended questions are those that are so general that, again, we could be here all day talking about it, especially with an enthusiastic interviewee. Moderately open-ended questions, you limit, you want some context, and you are going to be open-ended in your phrasing, but you limit the topical area so that it's less likely to be a 15-minute answer.
Very good. This is important because most people only think about open-ended as a general category, broad sense, but you were able to provide some finer detail to it, which is important. So as we're thinking about open-ended questions where you're getting someone to elaborate and provide a description or a narrative of something, what are some of the key benefits? Again, we understand that you're going to get a lot of information, which is what we look for. But if we're to think about benefits more specifically as a list of sorts, what kind of things come to mind as the reasons why we want to emphasize open-ended questions?
Sure. Well, there are several, and they're up on the next graphic. Open-ended questions are more conversational. Let's put it that way. And so we're getting information, but they also tend to put our interviewee at ease. If we've done our preparation and we've done our research and we're asking cogent questions on their specific responsibilities, that's going to make people feel much more comfortable. They don't feel like they have to educate us about everything, just focus on what we have particular interest in. From our perspective, it allows us as interviewers to become more familiar with vocabulary. So terminology, what it means in the interviewee's area, can be very, very helpful, and that can pay a lot of dividends as we get farther into the audit work itself. I'd say a big reason for open-ended questions is getting more detail or getting more context. It's more interesting, too, because it's spontaneous, it's conversational. It's more interesting for us. It's more interesting for them. And it's useful if you're less than prepared, but this is not a benefit that I would lean into. I think we've said enough about the importance of preparation that should be apparent. But if there's some segment of your field, or rather of your planning, that you didn't have sufficient information, maybe there weren't enough documents or data, open-ended questions can be quite beneficial for us to get that context that we didn't get through our reading or through our research.
Absolutely, yes. It definitely provides a mechanism or an environment or a tone where the individual can speak at leisure. We want to control it, of course, but they're able to explain and provide more detail around subject areas of interest. So, given those positives or advantages, what are some of the disadvantages or drawbacks that we need to keep in mind as well?
Right. So for every upside, there's a downside. Some of the downside we can see is that people might go on and on. Let's take a quick look at that graphic. Too much irrelevant detail. So that on and on has two parts. You may get a lot of information that is not necessary for your purposes, so it's irrelevant. That's where your follow-up questions could be helpful. So losing control of the interview. Again, the skill of being the leader or the signaler is important in these kinds of situations.
Right.
So the cost benefit, if you will, taking too much time for the amount of useful information gained, that can be a disadvantage or a drawback of open-ended questions. And with highly open-ended questions, it can definitely seem that the interviewer rather, is unprepared. So, tell me what you do. You almost always are going to get, what do you want to know? It makes it, and it doesn't reflect very well on us. So we have to be careful of that. Or,
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, a couple of things that come to mind, and one of them is to not start the meeting with that type of question, but rather maybe later on you can broaden it up a little bit, but you start with something a little bit more focused so that the meeting starts with a more pointed this conversation around a topic of interest, so moderately open, and then later on you can open it up more if you want to. But if you start with one of those very broad statements, that definitely could be the impression that the interviewee has. Exactly. So thinking about closed-ended questions now, I found that they can be very helpful to verify a fact or to confirm a date or a name or something like that. So can we talk a bit about closed-ended questions and what are some of the things about it we should keep in mind?
Sure. With closed-ended questions, the answers are typically shorter. Most often, they're a yes/no kind of situation, but I'll talk about a few variations as we go through this particular graphic. You're generally going to get short answers, and as you said, they're very, very good for confirming details or determining specific details. So we're trying to determine, say, a scope of work that somebody does, the level of authorizations that they possess, the times that their office is open, roles, responsibilities. Anything that is factual or definitive is probably best confirmed with closed-ended questions. What's great about that from our perspective is that we can use the same question, say, as a questionnaire, and efficiently generate that precise, reliable data that we can compare across maybe several groups that do the same thing or several people that do similar types of work, and we can see whether or not there's a lot of variation. There are speaking of variations, there are three variations on closed-ended questions. The highly closed-ended question is one where you would say it's almost like designing a survey on a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being poor and 4 being excellent. How efficient would you say this process is? You might even go farther in terms of giving a specific definition to each of those numbers. Bipolar question is yes, no, agree, disagree. So any question that's going to get one of 2 possible answers. And then a moderately closed-ended question is one where you might ask about something, again, something definitive. So what are your hours of operation? Now, it starts with what, but you're going to get a very short answer from here to here, Monday through Friday from here to here.
Okay.
So moderately closed-ended questions are very important, especially as follow-ups. So you might have an open-ended question where someone describes their function, their process, and then you may ask a follow-up closed-ended question that is going to give you, like, for example, is this the most current version of the report? Yes or no?
Yeah.
No. When can I get the next one? I'll give it to you tomorrow. I'll print it out right now. So that kind of thing is a sort of a tag team of different closed-ended questions.
And it seems to me that it would be very helpful to mix and match, right? Combine. You gave us some examples of that, but you can definitely combine them so that your whole exchange with the individual is not just following that same one type, but rather mix it up a little bit. And even if you were to use a variety of closed-ended questions, you can still mix it up a little bit so that it's
Yes.
not just a barrage of two options, answers, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no, but rather you can mix it up as well. So those are different techniques you can also use. In terms of benefits or advantages, so we want to confirm facts or figures in some cases. That I will imagine is one of them. What are some of the other benefits of closed-ended questions?
Well, it saves you time. Closed-ended questions save us time because you go through a list of things that generally have really short answers to them. It's easy to compare the same, if we have the same script, essentially. It's easier to compare answers across a group of people. You get to the point really quickly. For the most part, you are more able to keep control of the interview because there's not a lot of dialogue here. And we can cover a lot of territory with such a thing, with a lot of closed-ended questions. So there, from our perspective, there are some significant benefits. Unless you have a low threshold for boredom, which I do, I find it very boring to administer a lot of closed-ended questions. I'd much rather have a conversation.
Right. I would definitely agree with that as well. So, in terms of disadvantages of closed-ended questions, I would imagine that you can lose track of time or lose track of the conversation itself if they go on tangents. What are some other disadvantages of closed-ended questions?
So closed-ended questions are boring. They're boring for me, but more often than not, they're boring for the person being interviewed. They also, because closed-ended questions result in very short answers, sometimes auditors will notice after the fact that they didn't obtain important information because they just asked a bunch of yes/no, yes/no questions. And that means that we might get details. So we fail to get some details in some cases. We get a lot of details in other cases, but there's nothing, we have no construct to hang it all on. So we miss the main ideas, the main essence of the area processor system. There's also not much in the way of rapport building here, which I also, I feel is a shame because we're often going to see this. We're going to see many of these people for a period of time while the audit goes on, for sure. And it'd be nice to build rapport from the very, very beginning. And if you're working in the same building as someone, you want to feel a sense of connection, or at least I do. So these are some disadvantages.
Right. I will agree with those for sure. One of the things that come to mind as well has to do with using closed-ended questions strategically as well. And I recall several instances where interviewing someone and the conversation starts to drift. And I realized that this is no longer part of what we need to discuss at this point, but you want to be respectful of the person as well. You don't want to, in a very harsh way, tell them that this is not part of what we need to discuss at this point. You try to be respectful of their effort, trying to provide information for you, but they have drifted off. So I very strategically use that closed-ended question. Maybe going back to a recap on a particular fact that came up during one of their narrative portions. And I say, could we go back to that point where you mentioned that this happens on Tuesday afternoons? Can you tell me more about that? And then you can bring them back to the subject area. without telling them that you were drifting off into something that was not part of what we were supposed to be talking about. So I find that to be a nice, gentler way of
Hmm.
bringing the meeting back on target. But this is very helpful because as we're thinking about doing interviews, and most auditors spend a lot of time in this space, this is very helpful to realize that there are different types of questions we can ask, and we can use them strategically to get the information we want while building relationships. So I believe that a very, very important takeaway here is to think about what you want to find out,
Hmm.
use open-ended questions as much as you can, and use closed-ended questions strategically for confirmations and to make sure that you get the facts straight about what you need to know. So thank you very much, Kathleen. I really appreciate your help here.
My pleasure.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.